And we're back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God. We're on chapter 46, part 3. The heat overwhelms me today, and the wine, he said in apology. Too, I am young no longer. Lucana said, "Let us retire to our chambers and rest until the cool of the evening." "Alas," said Saul, "I am to meet at the house of a few friends today, and it is already late. Do accompany me, Lucanus, and you also, Timothy. They are men of mind and culture, and while they are not Christians as yet, I am praying for this culmination, for they have influence in Athens." He yawned again, so widely that all his big white teeth were visible, and tears came into his eyes. He shook his head and laughed once more. "An hour's rest," said Lucanus. "Come, I am a physician. Will you not obey me, my dear friend, and grant me this concession?" He stood up, and his face was so earnest and grave and commanding that Saul said, "Very well, but only an hour." And he too stood up, staggered, caught at the table, and forced himself upright. He was aghast. "Can it be I am drunk?" he asked, ashamed. "No," said Lucanus, and shook his arm, and the others in the dining room grinned and winked at each other. "You are weary. Come, I have something most serious to tell you, dear Saul, and this is not the place. When you are in your bed, I will impart some news to you." Saul's eyelids were drooping, and he shook his head over and over. Lucanus dropped a small pile of golden coins on the table, an act Saul was seemingly incapable of observing now. When Lucanus motioned with his head to the pale, mute Timothy, and the young man took Saul's other arm, they led him from the room. There was loud laughter behind them, another thing which the sensitive Saul did not heed. They climbed the dirty, gritty stairs to the hot rooms above, and Saul's legs were heavy, and his feet seemed to sink into the floor, and he said, "I have never been drunk. I did not drink much. Have I become ill? This cannot be. I have no time for illness." "You are not ill," said Lucanus, "but you are very tired, and even the war horse must drop his head and slumber, and listen to no drum until he has slept." "The corridor swims," murmured Saul, as if he had not heard. "The air is afloat with mist. Yet I feel no sickness, no weakness. I wish only to sleep a little. Of a certainty, I have never been so drowsy before, and the thought of my bed delights me." He fell on his bed with a rich sigh of pleasure and a comfortable murmur. But Lucanus drew one chair in the miserable room to the hardly less miserable bed, with its soiled blankets, and sat beside Saul, who looked momentarily surprised in his drowsiness. Timothy, trembling, stood at the foot and clasped his hands hard together. Then, at the motion of Lucanus's head, he drew the ragged woolen curtains across the glare of the high, small window, and the chamber was immediately plunged into a hot dusk. Then Lucanus bent over Saul, laid his hand on the other's flushed cheek, and said, "Open your eyes, Saul, and look into mine, for I must have your attention." Lucanus reached to the table on which stood a candle, and he held it out to Timothy and said in a peremptory tone, "Go at once, do not delay, and light this candle at the fire in the kitchen, and bring it back with all haste." Saul heard this, and partly raised his head off the pillow, and stared at Lucanus. Lucanus held his hand tightly, as if forcing his own tired strength into Saul. In a moment the door opened rapidly, and the panting Timothy returned with the lighted candle, which blinked in the dimness like a painful red eye. Lucanus moved the candle slowly back and forth before the dilated eyes of Saul. Saul was still half raised in his bed. Lucanus murmured, "You will gaze intently at this flame, and when I snap my fingers, you will sleep. But you will hear all I say in your sleep, and will awaken at my signal, and you will be calm, accepting all. To his astonishment, Saul struck the candle with the back of his hand and sat upright, and looked at his friend with eyes no longer slack and moist. They glowed like blue flame. He said gently, "My dear Lucanus, I am no fool. I have seen hypnotism before, when Egyptian priest-physicians used it for the benefit of their patients. Though I have gave no sign of heeding, I have been aware since your arrival that you were burdened with sorrow, and so I know you bring dreadful news. I also know you drop pellets in my whiskey and wine, and I am grateful for that, for I am weary, and I knew it was to calm me. Am I a child or a man? Am I to be soothed by drugs and hypnotism for fear I will not be able to bear another burden, another grief, another despair? If you think I am a child, then I will be offended. If you consider me a man, tell me all, and as quickly as possible." Lucanus put aside the candle, and his whole ascetic face trembled, and Timothy quaked. "It is well," said Lucanus. "I regret that I thought to spare you, Saul, for indeed you are a man among men, and not a weakling whose emotions must be dulled for fear of hysteria and madness. But above all, I am a physician, and the habit of ministration is hard to overcome, and we are often of the opinion that it is best to spare others the sword of sorrow and anguish, and thus we denigrate mankind. We are men, and we are whimpering children." He spoke quietly, but his large eyes filled with tears, and he bent his head and began to speak in a low voice. Lucanus had visited the Christian community in Tarsus 2 months before, which Peter had asked him to do because of defectors and quarrels arising there. An evangelist, too, was needed for the heathen. "The Christian community," Peter had written, "in Tarsus has begun to question my authority, and they are antagonizing the Gentiles and those not yet converted." So Lucanus had obeyed. The Christians were still accepted in the Jewish community. For the majority of former Jews, they worshiped together in the synagogues, keeping all the holy days as in the days of their fathers, and celebrating together. When the deacons and the priests spoke of Yeshua of Nazareth and his resurrection, the unconvinced Jews listened politely, and many finally accepted him and his mission, and among them were some rabbis. Those yet unconvinced watched, and indulgent with tolerance, the consecration of the host, those who partook of the sacrament, and when the Christians sang the Psalms of David in their native Aramaic or even Hebrew, the Jews joined in with deep reverence. To them, still, the Christians were but an aberrant sect of Israel, which would survive or not survive, depending on the truth they proclaimed. Those who came in the name of the Lord should be respected, even if their message were in error. Though all was not completely calm between young Jewish hotheads of deeply traditional beliefs, and the self-righteous and the equal hot-headedness of Jewish Christians, it was generally admitted that the Christians spoke in love and a desire to save the souls of men, and so they should not be despised or attacked. But it was irritating to be told that unless even the most holy and pious of men accepted the proclaimed Messiah, they were doomed to spend eternity in hell, and that all their faithful forefathers were now burning in that dolorous place, including blameless infants and the prophets and King David and virtuous maidens and dutiful matrons. All the devotion and faith and love and obedience to God which the Jews had observed over the centuries, they were told, availed them nothing. They were damned, and they were still damned, and they would continue to be damned. Their love and faith and obedience and devotion might just as well have been given to devil or to Moloch. To the Jews, this seemed outrageous and an insult to God. The more wise among the Christian deacons soothed their ire, and so the Christians were still admitted to the synagogues. The Gentile Christians were another matter. The Gentile Christians were another matter. They were excessively zealous, and their zeal was in no wise reduced by the fact that they knew nothing of the root from which their faith had sprung. Therefore they spoke of the words of the Messiah as mysteries, unaware of the Hebraic context in which he had spoken. When he had referred to Elias and Isaiah and David and Moses and Solomon and Abraham, they thought these mighty men, faintly mythical angels of glorious gods briefly inhabiting the earth to lift up the souls of men, very like their discarded sons of the gods and the goddesses or their former sylvan deities. In truth, many of them blithely incorporated the beautiful deities in their new religion, and quite a number confused Mary of Nazareth with Artemis or Diana, for were not all these holy virgins? Jesus began to take on the adumbrance of Apollo, the aspects of Zeus. They could not understand the protest of the Jews and the Christian Jews, and were annoyed by them. And when the old gods and goddesses and dryads and nymphs were referred to as demons, something uneasy stirred in them, born of past memories. Many had been adherent to Isis and were bewildered when the Christians refused to give her attributes to the mother of the Messiah. Some of the Christian Jewish deacons and priests set themselves the laborious task, in love and tenderness, to enlighten the Christian Gentiles about the faith from which the Messiah had sprung, and told how he had declared that he came not to overthrow the law, but to fulfill it. Therefore, the converts must know about the law, or they certainly would never be able to encompass the teachings of the Messiah. They must know about Moses and the patriarchs. But some of the new Christians said disdainfully, "That is past and gone. We need only the Messiah." But if you do not know of what he spoke, then how can you comprehend his words and his intentions? And his mission, The deacons and the elders did not have notable success, for their words were incomprehensible to the converts, who found it all a little tedious and had nothing to do with the immediate second coming, and their own glorification and their splendor and their rule over the earth and the consignment of unbelievers to an eternal hell, which they would contemplate from the battlements of heaven in happy justification and complacence. This made the priest and deacons shudder. "But you know all these things. You have encountered them yourself," said Lucanus to the intently listening Saul. "Alas, yes," said Saul. "I often wonder if Peter were not wiser than I." Perhaps it is enough to accept the Messiah as Lord and God and Savior. These poor ignorant people are faithful, at least, and I do not recall hearing that all the ancient Israelites honored the prophets either. And he smiled ironically, and Saul smiled in answer. "Shall only the wise and the cultured inherit heaven?" asked Saul. "Heaven forbid, for the controversies they would provoke, even in heaven, and would make it a hell. No one is more insistent and intolerant than those who called themselves intellectuals, as I observed myself in Israel among the Sadducees and the Pharisees." In spite of his apparent calm, he was beginning to pant, and his eyes had fixed themselves with mingled terror and fortitude on Lucanus, awaiting the blow of the sword. He sat upright now in his bed, his arms embracing his knees. The controversies would have remained in the Christian Tarsus community without danger, except from militants and defectors and self-interpreters and schismatics and dissenters, had it not been for the overzealous who were convinced that they had a mission to destroy every faith they encountered except theirs. They scorned the teachings and the persuasions and the reasonings of the mild and the gentle and the loving. The heathen world must be converted immediately, its idols overthrown, or God would not hold them guiltless. So, as had done their brethren in Rome, They openly attacked religious processions, rushed into temples, and overthrew the statues of gods and goddesses, shouted on the street corners that all men were doomed if they continued to honor the ancient inhabitants of Olympus, and that those who did not accept the Messiah immediately were accursed and condemned to everlasting torment. When he returned, which would probably be tomorrow, and that the obdurate were unclean, vile, anathema, and to be avoided by all good men. Worse still, the laws and the lawgivers of Rome, or any other local authority, were to be disobeyed passively or openly as a sign of the withdrawal of the Christian community from other men. "We are the witness," they cried in the marketplaces and the fori and in heathen temples. "Believe us, or you must die and writhe forever in the flames of hell. Who is Caesar that we must obey him? He represents the decadent, the past, the passing, the wickedness, the unjust, licentiousness, voluptuous, worldly, the depraved, the established evil. We bring to you freedom from Caesar and his monstrousness and his laws. We are another world, ruled by the Messiah, who is surely expected even in the days in which we live." The Roman military, honoring the greatest of their generals, Augustus Caesar, have conferred on him the mantle of divinity, raised a temple to him in Tarsus, as they had done in many other cities, and established therein a gigantic and glorified image of their dead Caesar, whom many accounted greater than Julius himself, who had also been declared a deity. Priests had been appointed to serve him and to receive sacrifices, and retired captains and centurions and soldiers haunted his temple, sighing over these decadent days, wherein military prowess was less honored than a mean politician, with a snake's tongue and crafty businessmen and bankers and merchants and stockbrokers. Though many of them, being old Romans, did not believe in the divinity of Augustus Caesar, they delighted in honoring a symbol of integrity, arms, pride in Rome, Rome herself, and the glorious days when Rome had stood among her lesser nations like a colossus of law and honor and order and probity. It was into this temple that a number of Christians roared one sunset, when some of the rheumatic old captains and centurions were praying honor to Augustus and their nation, and not only screamed woe to those present before the altar, with it on the sound of thunder and destruction, and the altar lights leaped up amid the tangle of silk like veritable flames out of Hades, perfumed with incense and burning flowers. The priests rushed in horror to survey the ruins, and they lifted their hands and cried to the aghast worshippers, "Let this infamy be avenged, or we are not Romans, but only asses and dogs." The Romans, being tolerant and cynical toward their gods, had overlooked the former excesses of the Christians, despite protests from local inhabitants of Tarsus, who cared about Isis and Cybele and Osiris and Horus and the multitude of other Eastern gods. But when Caesar Augustus had been attacked, the patience and tolerance of the Romans came to a cold and vengeful end. Religion might be attacked, for every priest, as everyone knew, believed that only he had the truth, but an attack on Augustus was an attack on Rome herself and flouting of her authority and rule and law, a display of enormous contempt for all that was Rome. The centurions and the generals and the captains and the soldiers came in a body of the legate and demanded justice, vengeance on that Jewish sect, including all the other Jews in Tarsus. Had they not wrought infamy on Rome? Were Romans meek donkeys that they should be openly defamed and ridiculed? Dishonor demanded to be washed out in blood. The noble history of Rome had been spat upon, reviled, and with it all her sons. Worse still, if the desecrators were not apprehended at once and punished, then Rome might as well furl her banners and slink back behind her walls and surrender to the barbarians and let the orderly world collapse into shrieking chaos.